Last paragraph in the Schaff set, the English translation, reads as follows. Thus, since on the one hand, the idea of cause differentiates the persons of the Holy Trinity, declaring that one exists without a cause and another is of the cause. And since on the one hand, now I'll stop for a second. I would just stylistically and looking at the Greek, it uses mende. So I don't know why the translation went this way. It makes more sense to say, and since on the other hand, the divine nature is apprehended by every conception as unchangeable and undivided, for these reasons we properly declare the Godhead to be one and God to be one, and employ in the singular all other names which express divine attributes. So he says earlier on that the question as it was presented, and he recognizes that it could be an objection, and certainly as Muslims use it, it's an objection. That the whole idea, and this is really what the logical problem of the Trinity thing is all about, is, of course, to try to say this is logically incoherent based upon applying the same standards to the relationship of the persons as you have ontologically to the existence of the divine being. It's no matter how hard you fight, you are conflating categories. And that comes up here in his very concluding statement, having argued for the deity of Christ, having argued that you cannot, there's a section in here, don't have time to read the whole thing. Like I said, it's available online. I would recommend it to you if you are really interested in these kinds of things to read through it. But he had argued that the Father does not do anything separately from the Son. The Son doesn't do anything that is not perfected by the Spirit. So within what we would call the economic Trinity, there is this consistency that flows from the unity that is theirs in the full possession of the divine nature. And yet they're not doing the same thing. And so the illustration to use is if we say that we have been given life by God, the scriptures tell us that this life comes from the decree of the Father. The Son gives life to whom he wills. The Spirit's the one that makes us alive. But he says we don't say that we've received 3 lives. We've received one life, and we recognize that one life comes from God. And when I'm speaking of the life that I've received from the Son, that's not some different kind of life than what would come from the Father or from the Spirit. I recognize the life I received from the Son is in perfect harmony with the decree of the Father, and it's been brought to me by the Spirit of God. There's perfect harmony here, and this is his argument. And it's part of his argument as to why he concludes you don't use the phraseology 3 gods, because it's inappropriate to do so. But the point is that even in this final, well, you could identify it as a single sentence. Suppose if this was the living translation of the Greek, it would probably be about 6 sentences. But still, let me read again and listen to how Gregory, and you can't force anybody to do this. Okay, critics can ignore these distinctions and ignore the difference between relationship and ontology, and there you go. But I'm talking to Christians here for our understanding and our benefit and our edification. Since on the one hand, I'm going to go ahead and do the mende. Mende is a construction in Greek language that comes across into English as on the one hand, on the other hand. Okay. And this is it's a somewhat complex sentence because you've got some articles thrown in and an infinitive, but anyways, I'm just going to translate it that way. Thus, since on the one hand, the idea of cause differentiates the persons of the Holy Trinity, declaring that one exists without a cause and another is of the cause. Now, I didn't have time to go back and because I know it's in Twitter someplace, and Jake used a particular quotation that is different in its phraseology, but I couldn't find it quickly as to what it was. The point being that the first aspect of one hand, other hand is differentiation of the persons, not origination, not creation, but differentiation of the persons, declaring that one exists without a cause and another is of the cause. Now, I think the idea, and I think it was the same thing with the Calvin quote, the idea is to introduce an implicit subordinationism, which makes sense from an Islamic perspective. It's not what the Quran did, but that we discussed that briefly as well. I continue to think that is a fatal objection. I really do. That I don't think just laughing it off is enough. And I don't think that, I'm sorry, I just have not seen, actually I don't see I almost never see Islamic exegesis of the Quran the way you see Christian exegesis of scripture. I've read major portions of tafsir literature, and I've just always been amazed at the substantive difference in the Christian desire to and ability to engage in grammatical, historical exegesis of the text. You just don't get that. And in fact, there's a resistance to it amongst Muslims. Some people call it historicization, and if you do that, you destroy faith in the Quran. It's fascinating, well worth expanding on some of that stuff. But anyway, point being, the idea is, well, Gregory is talking about the Father is not caused, but the Son is caused. And so I'd want to look very carefully at exactly what what anaitios means, what presbuon means, and exactly how it's being utilized and what's being asserted there, but in light of what Gregory says in the rest of the epistle. This is a distinction of relationship. It's a logical distinction. It is never a temporal distinction. And yet, this is the great challenge of Christian theology in discussing the nature of God, is our language is fundamentally temporal. Every verb we use, even when we try to be atemporal in the utilization of like an infinitive or something, it's still in a context. You can't avoid it. And so I'd want to look at those things, but the balance in Gregory is found in the day portion. So, and since on the other hand, the divine nature, the theia, the theia phusis, the divine nature is apprehended by every conception as unchangeable and undivided. Unchangeable and undivided. And Gregory is affirming that the Son possesses this divine nature, this ontological reality, that he's eternally existed as God and in possession of that divine nature. For these reasons, he then says, we properly declare the Godhead to be one and God to be one, and employ in the singular all the other names which express divine attributes. But it's that on the one hand, on the other hand. And so he recognizes where the objection's coming from, but what he's saying is, in the final analysis, when you do not conflate the categories, then the result would be we do not utilize the phraseology of three gods, because there is only one being of God, and that the relationship of Father, Son, and Spirit is not something that changes the indivisibility of the divine being. So it's not like the Father possesses it and then he just sort of shuttles it out to the Son, and then you have arguments as to then whether the Father and the Son then give that to the Spirit, or whether the Father alone gives the Spirit spiration, and all the rest of that argumentation that takes place at that point, which once was the stuff of dinner conversations across the Christian world. And now I wonder what percentage, I mean, Eastern Orthodox folks know about it because it's sort of definitional for them. But man, most folks in the West know nothing whatsoever about that whole discussion. People went to war over things like that in the past. But again, this is called On Not Three Gods. It's in the volume that contains the writings of Gregory of Nyssa. Some search engines might pull up Ablabius, Ablabius, if you want to try to find it and look at it yourself.